Hey, everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, it's a fabulous co-host.
Not as always, just today, it's me, Diana.
And unfortunately, Jackie was not able to make it to our recording today, which it's okay. It's a sad event. We're going to get through it.
She's fine.
She's fine. Everything's fine. It's just, I like having everyone
fine.
Here. I consider you all
Summer
to be...
scheduling is challenging.
I know, but when everyone's here, I consider you all to be like protective factors in my ability to talk about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, which we do every week. I get used to the
just like
routine.
A warm hug.
It's good. If something bad has been going on in the week, it's a nice way to center myself. And we were kind of talking about those good feelings and how fortunate we are to have such supports. And when we were thinking about good feelings, we were thinking, well, part of our job is working with individuals who don't always have that as a background. And what are the factors that might be of most use to supporting their growth and their healing? And we were very, very lucky to have a special guest join us, who is now unofficially, I guess, the third co-host of the show because Jackie's not here. And that is... She's been promoted from special guest to co-host. And that's Dr. Camille Kolu. Camille, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I am so honored to be here and maybe share some of these good feelings that you're having. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
So, Camille, you are going to be, we only have a few guests who I think have done this. It's kind of like the hat trick of they've been on the show. We've seen you talk at conferences. I think actually we've seen you talk. I know I've seen you talk at two. I saw you do the Stone Soup, but I think it was 2 years ago. And then at Thompson Center. And you're someone who I emailed unrelated to the show with a question, and then you were very kind to email me back with lots of resources. And now you're on the podcast. So it's a hat trick. It's a Rob hat trick of professionalism. So good. Congratulations.
The
you did it.
triple Lutz.
Oh my gosh. I'm going to have to look up your email. I think I just put that together. Rob, I had no idea that was you that I emailed.
That's
thank you for coming to those conferences.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing, right?
It was good. They were great. They were great talks. And so you made it on, you were on our short list to talk with, but I already had another question. So there you go. Congratulations. There's a certificate. It's coming in the mail.
I can't wait. I'm going to frame it.
So we are going to be talking about a topic that I think more and more folks are speaking about trauma and trauma-informed care. But I think a lot of the work that you have been publishing on, some of the work that you've been speaking on, really has more to do with kind of bigger picture issues. I consider bigger picture issues when it comes to trauma-informed care. Less about like, what's the procedure that looks like, and more about combining what we know about trauma and healing and looking at protective factors and how behavior analysis can support the usage of the multiple protective factors that exist and working collaboratively with other professionals. So I think that's a very different take than I think a lot of what some of the what's the best practice for trauma-informed care that we're seeing, which again, great articles. We love a lot of them. We've had some of the authors on before, but it's a very different spin on what trauma is, how trauma affects the body in ways other than just outward behavior, and what we can do to practice some, techniques and skills with families to support long-term, lifelong protection against trauma or to mitigate the impact of trauma that has occurred. So we're very excited to talk to you about that today.
Thank you so much. I just want to point out that is incredibly intentional. I think backing away for me from the word trauma and really focusing instead on ACEs. So adverse conditioning, but not in the way that we think of adverse childhood experiences only, right? I'm looking at adverse conditioning and adverse clinical experiences that we perpetuate, that we've had ourselves, adverse coercive experiences, and all of those things. And when you look at it that way, it just becomes so much more compassionate and contextual, right? So we don't have to touch the word trauma if we don't want to. We don't have to look at specific procedures necessarily, although we can. But it's just about how do we look at healing and protection, and it's all about that ethics code item of doing no harm and doing the best we can for our clients every day.
Sure. So why don't we take a step back, and for listeners who have not had a chance to email you and see you 2 times at conferences, hear a little bit more about yourself and how you came to be interested in this topic.
Oh, okay. I was super, super lucky when I got to college. So I went to the University of North Texas, and I went originally for music. I played the trumpet and the piano, and I got involved with a person with autism, actually with Rett syndrome, very, very early. And I was what she and her family called her special friend, like somebody to hang out with her. I had no idea what behavior analysis was. I had no idea that UNT at the time was like the premier location to study that stuff in person with wonderful professors. But I was there. And the music school was right across the street from the UNT Department of Behavior Analysis. It just was right there. And so I would often be practicing, and I would wander around and draw and see all these amazing professors. And eventually I took a course over there, probably in my second year. And just as many of your listeners, maybe, and even yourselves, I was just completely hooked. I thought the worldview was so compatible with what I was interested in. And I was interested in contextual factors on learning. I studied concurrent schedules of reinforcement there with Dr. Jesus Rosales Ruiz. I studied autism there with Dr. Shala Alai Rosales. And I loved it so much. And at the same time, I was working on my master's, and I finished all the way through. And I thought, I'm missing something. I'm missing something really big. I think I'm missing an understanding of how the brain affects behavior. I think that's what it is. And so, sure enough, that is what it was. That's the missing piece for me. And so I went over to Rutgers and studied, at the time they called it behavioral psychology, biopsychology, and behavioral neuroscience. That's the department it was. It was under psychology.
Yeah.
And got to work in neuroscience and olfactory conditioning, and wonderful understanding they had about this interaction between the brain and behavior. And it really did fill in those gaps for me. I had done a lot of work in autism by that time, but I focused for that 5 years in Rutgers in New Jersey on animals. And after I learned about stress and learning from that animal behavior perspective, moved to Colorado with my family and started working with people again. And all of a sudden I realized every single human being I've worked with here has some kind of complicating factor. They were all over the lifespan. They had all kinds of different genetic differences, intellectual differences. It wasn't just autism anymore. And it wasn't just early childhood. And I thought, I'm going to have to put all this stuff together. And once I did, I found that key factor was the history of the organism, that original thing I'd been interested in. And so I started looking at it in that different way, not just that molecular perspective of antecedent and behavior and consequence anymore, but really thinking about the history and how could I document that? And man, what risk factors does that bring to my client now? And this client who's 67 years old and has been through trauma and has autism and is going through dementia now. And when I started doing that, I tried to kind of document my approach. And that's kind of how the safety model was born, and what kind of catapulted me into working with what I would call adverse conditioning.
So, Camille, I do want to talk a little bit about kind of the brain and kind of neuroscience and neurobiology. And one of the things I think that's always been tough in our field, and it's something I'm less precious about as time goes on, but it does feel that sometimes when the brain terms come up, that's when you see a lot of the folks in the audience go, oh, did I go to the wrong talk? Is this going to be all mentalistic? I can't see a brain, therefore I can't change the brain, therefore I don't care. And, brains exist, whatever. And just kind of that hand waving. Is that something that you still kind of see with newer students as sort of our field continues to grow and to look back at the past? Or is that still something that when you start talking anything brain related, it's, walls go up?
Sure. No, that's such a good question. And I think it's really sad because there's so much potential there, right? After I did my PhD at Rutgers, and then I did a long stint in ethics and teaching for University of Colorado at Denver. And as you say, students, well, they either do what you suggested, there's kind of a wall that comes up, oh my gosh, this again. And then there's a lot of people that love it. And I think a lot of us have been more interested in trying to explain things away by relying on these assumptions. I think that has done so much harm, right? So these reductive, unhelpful discussions of trauma as an explanation, and or the brain, because the brain did it, because trauma, right? I think that's done a lot of harm, and it's made people maybe be reductive and not delve into something that is actually really, really complex. It's a wonderful person, a wonderful balance when you are able to actually kind of reduce or distill, I should say, a concept like what the brain does or the function of one of these really important parts of the brain and how that contributes to behavior without making everybody turn off right away or feel stupid, but also highlight on what the meaning of that is and not be too reductive and not overly explanatory, right? So I think that as we've all embraced these explanations based on the brain, we've done a lot of harm when we tried to assume that everything is explainable this way, or maybe that we don't need to have a really fine understanding of how those things work. We do need to really understand those, but not everybody has to understand them all in order to benefit from the principles that are true regardless. Sort of like it's okay for a staff person to not be able to explain all the intricacies of function and still run your behavior plan really nicely because you have described it technologically, you know. Mm-hmm. But for me, the brain comes into play in lots of ways with adverse conditioning because deprivation, and maybe if you think about it in terms of stimulus schedules or schedules of reinforcement, right? Those early experiences we have, they do change the brain. They do change how we develop and grow. Something that your clients may struggle with in autism may look a lot like what my clients struggle with in terms of their regression and developmentally or stereotypy related to what they went through in terms of trauma. And then it changes our bodies in other ways medically, you know. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but yes, it's a big problem. And it's also very helpful to be able to understand a little bit about our neurobiology and how that influences behavior.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for the explanation. So before we dive into some of the more nitty-gritty of the articles, we should probably say what articles we'll be discussing. I was very close to just not even bothering to do that part.
That's my job. And I was like, I had already moved past it in my mind. Yes. So Dr. Kolu has provided us with 2 articles to review today, and they are Providing Buffers, Solving Barriers, Value-Driven Policies and Actions That Protect Clients Today and Increase the Chances of Thriving Tomorrow. That was written by Kolu and published in Behavior Analysis and Practice 2023, online publication 2023. And also, Reflections on Choice and Control, Informed by Lessons in Parenting, also by Kolu. This was published in Operance Magazine 2024. I believe, or 23.
It's like a double.
It's like a double, yeah.
I was trying to write a citation for it. I was like, what do you do when it's 23 and 24? Come on.
Yep. You gotta crack open the APA 7 for that one, I think.
I did. I was at least get as much as I could Google it. So, all right. So that's what we'll be discussing. So, you know, as kind of continued context, Camille, when we talk about sort of adverse effects on the brain, adverse effects on health, do you mind? I mean, your article does a really great table of like, here's all the bad things that can happen. But I think it's important to really talk a little bit about those impacts because it's a good distinction later on when you're talking about the difference between buffers and a lot of the other terminology that gets thrown around when we're talking about care, you know, for adverse conditioning. So do you mind kind of sharing like what are the impacts other than, man, that's bad, or, oh, kids shouldn't have to go through those sorts of events? Like there are physical and neurological changes. So what are some of the dangers of being in those traumatic events or those adverse events?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mentioned deprivation of basic needs, right? Very thin schedules of reinforcement across the basic needs we have, like social interaction or food, those very basic things. Of course, that does deprive our brains and our bodies of what they need. Somebody might look underdeveloped, for instance. And true, the brain of somebody who has been through really rich, loving interactions during childhood looks very different than somebody who's been exposed to maybe growing up in a orphanage. And we've seen some of those studies. One is cited in the article. But I think overall, the next big thing, and one of the big findings that Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris has described really well in her book and several of her published articles, is that medically, long-term exposure to the stress hormones that accompany those adverse events and experiences, those are toxic. I mean, those are harmful to our bodies. And there are biological changes that accompany those stress hormones and those changes. And those changes often cause and interact with subsequent medical problems that somebody may experience through their lives. And so, of course, your listeners are probably pretty familiar with those old Kaiser studies, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Kaiser funded these studies that were looking at why exactly this very early life experience that could be determined adverse or aversive, how that changes the medical outcomes for people in a lifelong and dose-dependent, I think, is key, a dose-dependent way. And how impactful that is. Think about for our clients, somebody might have been exposed to things you don't know about before they were 5 years old. And now here they are, age 7 or 8 or 9, and they're going through something medically that a child shouldn't have to go through. Medically, like they're having heart issues, or they're having some kind of issue with breathing. They're having exacerbations with their lungs. Something is going on with their dental health, their sexual health when they become a little bit older. There are literally hundreds of studies now that tie those early life experiences to the medical problems we have later. And the Kaiser did a pretty good job of finally nailing down that relationship and realizing that we can have those kinds of problems earlier in life than we should. And so we might have earlier onset of medical needs that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. And we need to know to screen those people who are at earlier risk of those things. But those things also can show up in ways that we wouldn't look for behaviorally. So I think I mentioned earlier, you're trying to do differential diagnosis for a student who's got some kind of medical issue. And you think that something is maybe related to trauma, or maybe ADHD, or maybe autism. You do need to know the impact of early life experience, because that might mean medically that they are more at risk for something you need to screen for, treat for, maybe rule out, medicate for differently because of what they've been through. But some of the research on this is coming from like the brain and behavior side. So when I talk later in some of the articles about learned helplessness, for instance, those adverse experiences people go through, they also change the brain in other ways. And those changes are preventable many times. So the things that cause, for instance, all the medical stuff I've been talking about, those might be preventable if we taught folks how to control their stressors in a behavioral way. And so a lot of these issues do come into contact with the behavioral aspects of what we do every day in ABA. We just haven't historically appreciated that as much, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't get to finish the piece from operants. It's about choice, right? So I'm assuming that you have a huge list of practices we should follow. Choice is probably 100%. If you're not using choice constantly, you need to use it all the time, right? Am I right? I just looking at the cover, I'm assuming that's what it was.
It was about pigeons, actually.
Oh, is it? Okay, so is it about pigeons or about always choice? And here's my master list of 10 awesome treatments that you should be thinking about when you're trying to avoid adverse control. Was that it? Did I get it?
Oh man, I would be so wealthy if I had a quarter for every time people ask me what is the list of contraindicated procedures? Surely here's the list of what you shouldn't do, and here's the list of what you should do if somebody's been through trauma. That's just too reductive. Like all of those questions, it's not individualized. So it could be just as harmful, right? To say, okay, he's got trauma history, so I need to definitely do A, B, and C. If you're not looking at his individual or her or their individual presentation right now, you don't know anything. I think people are really interested in explaining. I'm much more interested in just asking about history, because there is no comprehensive list. I love doing a risk versus benefit analysis and coming up with, for an individual client now, the list of contraindicated procedures for them. Mm-hmm. But that individual client list looks very different from their counterpart in the group home, or somebody who's a little bit older or younger, or lived in a different part of a country, or went through a certain conflict. So I think in either case, it's really harmful to try to make a list if you're not doing that individually with respect to what the client needs and has been through.
Mm-hmm. I know I was really appreciative of that, of the way you wrote that in that piece, and certainly using choice as an example of something that I think, without thinking about it, it's like, oh, of course, everyone loves choice. Choice is great. We should give more choice. Choice is important. Assent is important. And really looking at how anytime, even something that, is as good as choice can be, as that reductive, everybody loves choice, and not taking into account the learning history of the individual. And then you list so many factors that could actually point to, hold on, whoa, you're blowing it with this client. You're making choice aversive, which sounds paradoxical. Like, that's impossible. You can't do that, Camille. What are you saying to me? Do you mind talking a little bit about some of those kind of situations that could result in choice actually being harmful?
Well, I think people understand intuitively that idea of choice paralysis, right? When I taught ethics, we would talk about that. I think it's a Barry Schwartz article. It's been a while, and I've nursed a lot of babies since then, so I can't really remember. But people understand that idea, right? When there's 25 flavors of jam on the table, I get a little confused. I'm not sure exactly which one I want to use right now.
Order the jam flight, Camille. That's the answer there. And then
the flight is always the answer, Rob. That's always the right answer. But I think people also understand like that manipulative potential, right? Even just thinking about marketing, how you could put something in a prettier package or put it eye level on the shelf or in the center of the aisle and not on the periphery where we should be shopping, right? And how that influences consumption. But when you're thinking about with respect to an individual with some needs that you're trying to treat, thinking about their history of choice is what should always come first. What are the conditions under which they've experienced choices in the past? The idea of a constructional approach, I think, is very helpful here, because if you're not already thinking about degrees of freedom and how can I facilitate an array of opportunities for a person to feel comfortable switching between alternatives, and what makes a history, by the way, in which somebody might feel punished for switching, maybe feel like they've committed and now it's not okay to switch, right? Or maybe a certain kind of choice was looked down upon or made fun of by their social peer group, or maybe there was only one available and you had to do, so to speak, consume that choice. So the question should always come down, for me, to asking, what is the individual's history with respect to encountering choices and consuming those choices, making those choices, saying no to any choices, right? Most of my clients for whom trauma has been a part of their lives, they have not received a supportive environment when it comes to saying no. So maybe they've tried to say no, but it hasn't been heard. Or they didn't have a repertoire that was understandable to the listener. Or maybe their caregivers weren't allowed to say no. And so they're sort of perpetuating that and not allowing the client to say no respectfully, right? So all those questions about what are the conditions under which choices occurred, under which it has not been allowed, and under which the caregivers have been giving choices. So that one is another issue, right? Is looking at the repertoire of the person who's giving choices. Does that person know how to give choices in a way that's not coercive?
Yeah.
Do they know how to give multiple options? If nothing is okay to say no to, does the caregiver know, how am I going to respond when this kid says no? Do I have some skills to take care of myself and accept that? Or am I going to come down hard on them for saying no to something I think they should say yes to, Yeah.
That one. I want to do that one.
Yeah.
No, I'm the adult. I know it's best.
Yes.
Oh. Okay.
And I think too, we talk about teaching folks to make choices, but it's so much more complicated than you think it might be to try to teach even that skill, which is, at the very initial rung of our self-advocacy ladder. Because like you're saying, someone may say yes to anything because that's what they've been taught is appropriate to do. They may say yes to the thing that's viewed as the popular thing or whatever is going to like make the least waves, rock the least boats, right?
Yeah.
And then the next piece of it too is to go even further back. You don't even always know what it is that you want. And I can say that as a, highly verbal person that culturally I've been directed various paths such that I don't, you try to reflect. You're like, did I do what I wanted? I don't even know what it is that I wanted. And so then how are you supposed to teach someone what it is that they want, potentially divorcing that from what the cultural expectations are? It's really challenging and complex to get at this piece of choice. It's fascinating.
It really is. It's
area.
so fascinating. I would encourage your listeners to, right? That whole issue is on choice and control. And there are some really, really good articles in there. There's one by Joe Lang that's really stellar. There's some by, I think, Billy Baum is in there. There's a fantastic article by Ditsu.
I remember reading that one when it came out
on choice.
Yeah.
Yes, those issues of choice and control, they're ubiquitous. They're huge in trauma. But like you say, they're really, really hard for anybody.
Yeah.
I remember when my kid, I saw my 2, and this is a little bit recounted in the article, but he was 2 at the time, and his choices were not his own. They were like his sister's. She was 5, and she like gave him the side eye, and she's like, "You don't want to pick that cookie," And I was like, "I know what you're doing. You're trying to hang on to that cookie and make this other one look desirable for him." And he has no idea that he's choosing, quote unquote, the cookie that she wants him to have so she can have the other. I mean, we do that on every level with our clients, even with ourselves.
Our 12-year-old does that with his little brother, and it's less. It sounds like there was a little more subtle manipulation going on from your piece, but it's a little bit more like he just makes up these consequences for like, if you do that, this is going to happen, and it's like, no one has said that. Like, you've just made that up. Scare your brother into choosing something different. Like, if you do that, then mom and dad are going to say we can't do anything else ever again. So you better not choose that.
Oh, it's not just my kids.
Gosh. It might just be both of our kids. Like, I don't know what we did as parents, but
we have 3 children. You said both of our kids.
Well, both.
My
kids do that too.
Fair enough. Anyway, I'm absorbed in this table of contents for this Operants magazine. You're right.
Are you not subscribed to Operants?
It's
subscribe
so
today.
good.
It's free.
The other one is open access.
Fantastic.
The other article is open access, but that Operants one is somewhere on my website, and we can sure shoot it over to your listeners. But you do need to subscribe because it rocks. It really does.
Really good.
It's a really good art.
So, Camille, when we're talking about, whether it's trauma, we're calling it trauma-informed practices, or whether we're looking at just trying to create environments that have less averse control for clients, where did the idea of buffers kind of come into your own practice and writing? I made up a little story about where I thought it must have come in, but you probably should just say exactly where it came yourself, because that's just a narrative I made up from seeing you speak a couple times and reading your articles.
Oh my goodness. Now I'm really curious about the story, Rob.
I make little stories about like why things developed just based on the articles I've read. And we've read a lot of articles. I've got binders and binders of them. So it, you sort of create the little story and sort of the idea of like, well, people keep asking me, did you want to hear my? Okay. People keep asking me like, what are the procedures I have to use? And maybe at one point you actually thought there was such a list, because I know in my practice I always look for like, well, where's the list? Someone must have made the list. Someone must have done this already. And then contextualizing choice and having more kind of thoughts on how every decision and every process that we think of as good could be aversive in terms of how we try to control other people, whether it's parents who don't know any better, whether it's students or children in deprived situations. And then having the background that you have of working in neurobiology, sort of having access to some of the medical research on the health impacts and finding buffers as something interesting that kind of threaded that needle of, well, we need to have some targets that we can focus on, but at the same time, we need to be thinking of context over the specifics of every individual situation. If we're talking big picture, when working with clients, we can be. So I made that story up. I don't know if it's true at all. And you can let me know if those things have ever happened in that way.
Suddenly I'm reminded of Arrested Development, and where he's like, cute story. Yeah, many cute story. No, great story, Rob. That was a pretty apt description. I would say it's a little more straightforward than that, though. I mean, yours includes a lot of details I don't know if I was privy to at the time. But I'm just going to...
I did this, a dramatic retelling of it.
Yeah, it was
a
very...
TV movie.
Right.
It was a little bit more contextually rich, I think, than the one I'm about to tell. But to cut to the chase, I read... So I was feeding my newborn, and I read Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's work. And I read that story... And if your listeners haven't read it, they probably should check out The Deepest Well, right? It's really good. And I read it and I thought, okay, so somebody in the medical community knows that there are 6 things that if we did these 6 factors, right? And buffers are just areas in which action is documented in the medical literature to have protective effects against the biological and medical harms that result from ACEs. Okay. So if somebody knows about this, why aren't we doing it? That was it. And then I thought, okay, let me think about why we're not doing it. We're behavior analysts. We know how to operationalize these 6 things. Okay, there must be some huge reason that behavior analysts don't want to do this. So I set about trying to discover that. Mm-hmm. I realized pretty quickly, this is kind of sad, kind of silly, kind of funny, and probably true for a lot of us. Behavior analysts like complicated problems. We like to feel good about ourselves solving a big function issue and then getting funding and treating challenging behavior. I mean, by the nature of the word, challenging. We don't want to do easy things. That's somebody else's job, right? These 6 things are so easy. Teach your client how to arrange a healthy sleep environment, for instance. Come on, I'm not a social worker, right? I'm a behavior analyst, man. However, these things are so basic that we don't even do them for ourselves. We're above that, Come on, I can live on energy bars and caffeine, and I have my trunk full of toys. I don't need to sleep at night. I'm going to go home and have fun and do my own data sheets and work really hard on this FBA and email all my people back at 4 a.m. and demonstrate to my RBTs that I can do everything. And then we hit maybe 10 or 20 years later and we think, oh God, what was I modeling for my RBTs? What was I modeling for my supervisees? And I think when we start to look at it, we needed these things in our lives ourselves. Here we are being examples that we don't want people to follow that example, do we? Of that intense behavior analyst who's not taking care of themselves, but is inflicting plans on everyone else without doing them for ourselves. I don't think we want to be that, do we? When I finally started, I built my family up and I started looking around at myself. I was not healthy. I was not taking care of myself. I was trying, but it was really hard. Well, you know what? Every single time when I revisit the rhythms of the buffers, and I realized that life is about rhythms. It's not about individual instances of behavior. It's about change. And all during our lives, we are going to be buffeted about. We need to come back to that center of, okay, what are my healthy rhythms? Let me start doing those again. Let me remember how to take care of myself. When I do that, I'm going to take care of my people. And I love it when I'm able to take care of my people. And I can't do that when I'm not taking care of myself. And so that's all. Maybe even longer than your version, Rob. But truly, the nut in a nutshell, they discovered this already, but why aren't we doing it? And I thought, well, somebody's got to operationalize this, tie it to the ethics code, to the ABA dimensions, to policy. We've got to use this as an antecedent manipulation. We have to use this with ourselves, and then we will be able to work on it with caregivers who will then want to work on it with their clients. Mm-hmm. So it just filled in so many gaps that I saw. And I've never looked back since. When I started doing the buffers with my clients and caregivers, everybody has done better. I will never not do it.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education,
dual degree in special ed and ABA,
or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey everybody, sorry to pause the podcast for a second, but I wanted to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved, and by listening, you can earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to the show, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click on the link in your show notes to go right to the page. And you'll need to enter in some secret codes as well as some other information. And these are secret guest codes from Dr. Kolu. And the first one is sourdough. SOURDOUGH. It's a yeast. It's a type of bread. Is it all of the above, Diana?
It's a type of bread.
Type of bread. Sourdough. All right, now back to our discussion on protective factors. I absolutely loved the article laid them out so well. I think as much as they are sort of those like, oh, well, not common sense, but the kind of those basic needs, I do still think, and again, maybe that's just me being a behavior analyst, adding complexity. You lay out a number of ways in which behavior analysts can take these relatively simple life things, and there is still a complexity to getting individuals, or helping individuals, there I go with my bad choice language there, helping individuals to support the development of the buffers. So we've got our 6. We've got the nurturing relationship, nutrition, regular physical exercise and activity, healthy sleep, mental health support, and then mindfulness-based or other stress-relieving practices. So even something like sleep, we've talked about it before on the show, just being, telling a family, oh, yeah, you just got to start good sleep hygiene. Even just that, which isn't even capturing all of what goes into sleep, that can be so complicated to do because there are a lot of factors that need to kind of go into it. And I did love that about your article, sort of operationalizing things so we can start working on, well, how would you do it so that people actually want to hear you? Because I'm sure there's been a period in your career, I know there's been a period in mine when I've talked about importance of nutrition and sleep, and I've just got the eye rolls of like, you are not the first person to tell me that, and you are not going to be the last. And if that's all you got, I'm not really interested in hearing any more of what you have to say.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think the two important things in the article visually are probably those little charts where there is a visual, maybe a job aid if you print it out on not buffers, but barriers. What are the barriers to somebody using these things? Because, I'm going to go back to the 6th buffer right now, stress relief.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 components of stress relief are predicting the stressor and exerting some kind of healthy behavioral control. If we do those 2 things, we don't necessarily have the medical impact of stress. And so what does that mean? It means we have to control a situation that's stressful for us. Well, there's this very interesting thing about the buffers. It's like, the part of the brain that I researched in my neuroscience degree was the hippocampus. And, people know a little bit about the hippocampus. Usually it looks like a booger. If you take it out of a rat brain, it's teeny tiny. It's like a little C-shaped thing. There's one on both sides of the brain. And it's involved when people learn or animals learn about place or about the context in which learning occurred. And if you wheel an animal through a maze, they don't learn about the place they were just wheeled through. If you're a cab driver in London, on the other hand, your hippocampus is huge. You have to remember all the grids, all the intricacies of where you are, and you will. And your hippocampus literally grows with that experience. Well, so that control over your environment is what makes the difference in the brain growing. And the buffers are like that. If you don't do them for yourself, if you don't have control over them, they don't make a difference. You could wheel somebody through life and say, I'm going to put all the buffers in their behavior plan because it's just so darn good for them, right?
Yeah.
And then they may or may not want to do them, and they may or may not do them, and they may or may not enjoy them. All of those things may or may not happen. Well, research tells us, and there's actually some elegant for the 70s studies in nursing homes showing this effect, that if somebody engages in all of these wonderful, healthy things on their own terms, whether they do a good or bad job, they're protected against death. I mean, this is in the nursing home. I love their measure at the time. They're so low tech, and maybe we should all be doing this, right? The researcher just put tape on the bottom of people's wheelchairs and measured how dirty they got. Are they wheeling themselves around to the activities, or are their wheels nice and clean because they've been sitting in their room all day? But they had 2 floors of this nursing home, and in one floor, the participants were exposed to all the same wonderful things, of rich schedules of interaction, all these buffering activities. But if they got done for them, they didn't help. So overall, that tends to be true with the buffers. It has to be somebody's own idea. They have to be the person with assent and autonomy and control over doing it themselves. Those are all values we espouse in behavior analysis right now in our ethics code. They're very clear to us. They're strong. We want to exert those and empower other people to experience those, but we forget about it with the buffers. And I often encounter behavior analysts who say, I have a client who just won't. He just won't do this. How do I make them do this? Well, did you hear? Did you hear what you just said? So in the article, what we need to do, and why we talk about the barriers to all these buffers, we need to understand, why is that so? Why is it hard? Why is it unapproachable? Why is it not appetitive for that person? Why is it not reinforcing? Maybe why is it not cued? Perhaps it's not available. Perhaps it's not appropriate contextually or culturally for him to do this. And so that's where the butterflies tool came in, was just trying to operationalize for behavior analysts. Okay, let's assume we do want to problem solve this, and that my client is coming to me saying, all right, I hear what you're saying. I will probably live a lot longer if I engage in this kind of stuff. But this one is really hard for me. I don't like it. I've always experienced a hard time around it. There's been coercion in my past around it. How can I figure this out?
So when it comes to sort of looking at tools like the butterflies and looking at the role of the behavior analyst in working with a client and their stakeholders, should they just start with thinking about the butterflies tool if they're new to sort of this? Because I know some of the buffers feel there were a couple of statements as you were writing and as I was reading that felt very like, oh, this is in the toolbox. This is prescriptive. I'm always going to do this. I'm always going to do that, which I think is a little bit anathema to everything that you've just been saying about if we just make everything prescriptive, then we're missing the point of the context, or we are setting ourselves up to be the experts who might be removing autonomy for a skill that an individual is very interested in actually trying. Like we might actually hurt their ability to do that. So are there sort of like general guidelines that you recommend for folks when they are starting to think about buffers and starting to think about barriers to buffers in their care and in their work with clients?
Yeah. No, I think that both things can be true here. Is yes, these are always in my, as you said, they're always in my toolbox. But I have to understand that on an individual basis, there are reasons that these aren't being tapped into for an individual I'm working with, or maybe their family. We have other levels of tools too, to kind of get an idea of where we're starting. Often with a client, and given that I'm working with the system support around that client, not the client. So that's just me as a behavior analyst. I'm usually working in systems. And so I start by asking the system, hey, I'd love to know, give me a lay of the land. How many of your clients' behavior plans already deal with these buffers And if you are dealing with them only as it relates to their behavior for decrease, or if you have some kind of prevention plan in place that's honoring these things, even if it has nothing to do with their behaviors for decrease. And so those two things are really important to understand from an organizational perspective. Are we talking about these with everybody, with every client and caregiver and staff, those three things? Or are we only doing it when somebody has an issue? For example, they're food restrictive behaviors, and that's why we're working on the food-related buffer. And so if it's only the latter, if they're only working with them in a reductive capacity, then we start with preventive education to try to let them know, hey, if I didn't even look at clients for a second, if I just looked at all of the caregivers that your organization is supporting, are there caregivers out there who don't have access to healthy food? Yeah. Are there caregivers out there who can't sleep at night because their client's behavior keeps them up all night? Yes. Okay. And so those caretaking capacities of organizations, the nurture capacity that we have, the ability to tap into community layers and to maybe publicize, hey, here is a list of all the food banks in the area. Here are a list of where your family can learn about safe and healthy sleeping practices. Here's a list of all the yoga opportunities for moms who are strung out, and here's the free ones, and here's the ones with childcare. When I look at nurturing in that sort of preventive way, all of a sudden the staff and the caregivers are shaking their heads going, yeah, you're right. There's some room for me to take care of myself. And you can almost see their shoulders relaxing as they think, okay, somebody cares about me for a second, and I'm going to be able to be a little less stressed this week. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, Rob, does that sort of answer the question there?
I mean, thinking about it from that system support and really that top-down idea of, well, how are we building communities where these are sort of just not exactly, there's an assumption that we're going to be focusing on helping people with them. We're going to be thinking about them. We're going to be working on minimizing barriers to access to them. I think that does certainly set a stage for an individual who then is responding to more severe problem behavior to not just be thinking about everything in the context of, well, I need to change this to make this problem go away, and be thinking more of that big picture of like, what are the things that are missing in a client's life that would minimize this, from occurring or increase the chance some other behavior occurred without just, I'm reinforcing this, I'm putting this on extinction, those kind of really molecular viewpoints.
Yeah. This whole conversation just reminds me a lot of the quality of life literature as well. And I know I've talked about it in the past, but one of my favorite articles in this area is Burgess and Goodstein, 2007. Mm-hmm. And because it's trying to look like over the lifespan, starting in childhood for autistic individuals, how can we ensure that we're building a proper quality of life? And one of the initial quadrants that they're focused on for children is the family and the health of the family, the stressors that the family is experiencing. Because if you can't have a good quality of life in the home, then there's, much less likely that child's going to benefit down the road. And it's these same pieces, right? And so when I worked clinically and talked with families, these were like the initial questions that I would start with rather than just jumping in and being like, Joey's doing great at school, is I would step back and I'd say, how are things at home? How is he eating at home? How's everyone sleeping at home? And are you, as a family, able to go do fun things? And sometimes we wouldn't even get to anything else in our meetings because those issues were so critical for families to be able to talk about that. Without building that initial, foundational family health, you couldn't really move on to talking more specifically about things. So it all ties together, and this is just one other like fantastic angle to get at those like larger contextual pieces that are absolutely critical to health.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Diana. I didn't really appreciate all that, I think, although I loved quality of life and I love some of the various interviews and inventories they have. But until I worked in what we call social emotional support in Colorado with birth to 3, and this was completely separate from behavior analysis. It was just in the context of people going out and doing early intervention with kids who needed a little extra help for whatever reason. A lot of times it was medical or something related to the birth of a second child or something like that. But those developmental interventionists always ask those questions and in the context of the family routines. So one of the ideas that I think we talked about briefly, but I want to come back to is if we were all appreciating behavior for what it is, I think we would look a little bit more at the cyclical nature of behavior, right? But also of our needs and how those are in flux all the time. We're not always our best selves. Our needs for different buffers are not always the same. And one interesting question that sort of cuts to the heart of what somebody needs or is planning on needing and how we can really help a person with buffers, for me, this question is, what has happened that changed recently in your life? And what did that bring up for you? And do you have any needs around those changes that I can help you with? On the flip side of that is, what hard or stressful things are you about to go through? And what do you think is going to be the most stressful thing about that? And how could I help you predict that and exert some healthy control over it? When we look at it that way, that's sort of taking a lens of one of the buffers and looking at the others through that. And I find that that's really helpful. Could we talk about mental health from that perspective?
I would love to, because I think when looking at buffers, we talked a little bit earlier about how some of them seem like, oh, that's the social worker's job. I'm a behavior analyst. I have nothing to do with it. Whereas others, I think there's a little bit of a push or pull of, why aren't we doing more here? Is it our job to be working in this field? Do we have the competence? Do we have the training? And I think mental health is one where I personally, just professionally, feel like I have a better understanding of mental health than I've ever had in my whole life. But at the same time, wonder, is my role to be like a therapist to this individual, and how am I benefiting? How could I be harming? And I think that can be really tricky.
Operate within your scope of.
Well, yes, I am always mindful of my scope of competence, but I think it goes a little beyond that in terms of how are we helping individuals with mental health? When are we reading a problem or a situation as a mental health problem versus a behavior? Do we need to separate the two? Should we be, right? So I think that'd be a great one to talk more about.
Yeah. I mean, in your setup there, you touched on so many, I think, misconceptions that people have about mental health, right? And also problems that we have with respect to how we're going to approach this. And this always comes up, by the way, when I'm teaching. So when I am in that role of ethics professor or I'm trying to do some supervision, people will ask me really important questions and the implications are huge, right? So my students, for example, will say, well, we shouldn't treat the person's behavior if there's a mental health problem, right? Or, hey, there's no way for us to treat mental health, right? Factoring in mental health is not in my scope of competence.
Right.
But I just want to call everyone's attention to the rate of mental illness. If it was true that we can't treat somebody's behaviors until their mental health has been, quote unquote, solved or fixed or fully addressed, we would be out of a job instantly, because almost every person is affected to some extent or at some point in their lives by mental illness and mental health related issues.
Yeah.
But I also think, and this has been really awesome to sort of wrap my brain around and to talk about with other people, I also think it's so critical to appreciate that mental illness and mental health can coincide. They can co-occur. And to appreciate that, you have to see them differently. You have to understand that mental health is not simply the absence of mental illness, but it is this other maybe constructability right? We can engage in mental health at any time in our lives with all of our mental illness on board. We can hold those two things lovingly and say, okay, anxiety, you might not be gone yet. But at the same time, I can look constructively at what mental health means to this person. And that's beautiful. That's easy to operationalize. And the one way, have y'all heard of PERMA? Not necessarily. Okay, good. Good. Because I think there's also a misconception that positive psychology is, perhaps not what we want to do. It's reductive, or it's inappropriate, or it's not for us. Mm-hmm. But it has this wonderful aspect to it, which is defining the presence of things and not just the absence of things. And so in a way, it's been leading the way in terms of constructive notions. Well, I got this from a little bit of Marty Seligman's work, and I'm sure you know who he is. That The Hope Circuit is the book that I read most recently of his. But I just want us to appreciate PERMA for a second. So that's a way of defining mental health. Mental health is when somebody has P. Okay, so the P in PERMA is for positive emotions. Think about that for a second. So under what conditions do you experience positive emotions, right? Great question about your clients. Wouldn't you love to know that answer? Now, backing up a second, I said that you could take the lens of one of the buffers and apply it to others. And so for just a second, think about relationships from this lens that I'm going to call PERMA, okay? And PERMA is how we define, again, mental health. So P is for positive emotions, E is for engagement, R is for relationships, M is for meaningful, doing things that bring you meaning, and A is for achievement. Okay, and so thinking about those things, first just thinking about them for their own sake, for mental health's sake, what if I looked at my clients' goals and I said, what brings them meaning? When do they feel really engaged? When do they experience positive emotions? Who are the relationships they really value? And are they having enough time doing the other things that bring them meaning in the context of their relationships? And for the last one, when do they feel like they've achieved something? Right? That would be amazing. Yeah. There's meaning. There's your quality of life issue.
Absolutely. Those are great.
That lens transforms goal writing.
Yes.
And it's not without our scope, is it? I mean, it seems like those things map just fine onto the goals that I'm working with my client for almost everything I'm working with. If I look at those goals through that lens, then I'm doing behavior analysis, but with meaning. And when I talked about looking through one lens at another aspect of the buffers, look at relationship through that. So for example, I have clients that have non-existent relationships sometimes, to the extent that they've been living in mental institutions for perhaps 2 decades, rotating on different floors of that mental institution, thinking that the security guard is their best friend, maybe thinking the social worker who's going to retire next month and they may never see again, thinking of her as the mom figure in their life, thinking of the peer that came up on a mental health hold, thinking of her as their best friend, and then not realizing that she's going to get moved out to Pueblo next year or next week. They'll never see each other again. But if I look at relationships, I start to realize, we're doing a lot of damage if we ignore what is there in somebody's life, the meaning they've attached to it. On the other hand, if I look at it purposefully, I see myself in that role. I need to be really careful with boundaries. I can do a whole lot of work with meaning and achievement and really support them in a new way. So again, mental health and mental illness, 2 different things. Somebody can have both. It is within our scope to work on the mental health part. I'm not saying treat mental illness at all. I'm just saying do the things that help somebody be and feel happy and fulfilled and find meaning in their lives. And I don't find that out of our scope at all.
I love everything you just said. And even just making that distinction between mental health and mental illness, I don't know that I've heard it stated so clearly before, because the terms get conflated a good bit, but that is really helpful to me. And you're right, we can absolutely operationalize those components of mental health and think about them behaviorally.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad that's useful to somebody. And I hope that everybody sort of takes that moment to appreciate that about themselves. Because there's a lot of shame, I think, around mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at our own lives and we think, oh, how can I be a good behavior analyst when I am struggling so hard? And I am not engaging in even the little habits on a day-to-day basis that would fulfill me. And here I am, again, imposing my plans on other people. But if we hold that piece with a lot of compassion and then look at the contingencies around us that have, and maybe in the systems that we've built around ourselves and our staff and our wonderful team of behavior analysts, have we done things that minimize their own health? Have we done things that didn't allow for them to grow in their mental health and exist in whatever problems they have, and just accept that and do what they can for a minute? Just do what they can to be healthy right now, So
I think that Camille, that's a great, not exactly alternative, but I think a good way to think about maintaining meaningful relationships with clients rather than transactional relationships. I think it's a good way to sort of think about buffers in the kind of bigger picture rather than, how am I curing this person? How am I going to solve the problem? Because I know for me, it's one of my pet peeves is when I am, hearing someone talk about a case or they're doing a case conceptualization and they sort of just feel they get to a point and they're like, I think there's some mental health there. Like, boom. And I feel like my response has been with the more pedantic, like, well, wait, what are the behavior? Like, there's more to this than that. But it almost feels like this, again, another wall has gone up of like, it's a mental health thing. So of course, once that's identified, it'll get solved by somebody because that's how mental health works. And, then we'll be able to do all these other things. And I think I would prefer in the future to sort of share some of what you've shared with us today in terms of talking about mental health, about what are the steps that can be taken, and just sort of dodging the bullet of like, well, let me tell you about what's going on in mental health, or I can tell, I know a little bit about which is, I think, the trap I often fall into, which then gets a lot of eye rolls of like, oh, it's great, you read a paper, good for you. That's not helping me with the problem I'm having. That's not supporting my mental health and my feelings of competence. So I think that's probably a better tack. So thank you for sharing, a step that can be taken even just by one person, by me.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so doesn't that also sort of remind you of the ethics code item 2.12?
Mm-hmm.
What a misunderstood item, right? Considering medical needs. If there's any possibility a referred behavior is related to medical or biological needs or respondent behavior, I think as well. What? How do I finish that sentence? A lot of people misinterpret that as I'm just supposed to rule it out. Okay. And that means put it off my caseload if that's the case. Mm-hmm. But I ask you, is there a possibility that any referred behavior is not related to biology? Honestly,
right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, even when talking about, looking at buffers or looking at how, one could use the butterflies tool, even if there is a medical piece that does need to be worked, collaboratively with a medical professional, there it is that collaborative piece of just
there
because a doctor said, oh, well, the issue is that unless there's the pill, and there are certain things that you give someone a pill and then boom, problem solved. But if it's an issue of an ongoing hygiene problem, there's only so many things that you're like, oh, take 2 of these and call me in the morning. There's only so many times that actually then resolves the problem completely. If it's a matter of changing diet, oh, well, yes, it is a medical issue, but it has to do with too much intake of salt or too much intake of a certain substance or not enough sleep that's leading to difficulties in other. Okay, well, just having a doctor write a prescription on a pad is only, that's only a part of it. You still could be a part of the solution of, well, how do you now take this medication? Or how do you now increase the amount of vegetables that you're eating to sort of resolve some sort of hormonal imbalance or whatever might come from that. That's my great understanding of medicine there.
Also lament their lack of opportunity to explore these larger contextual variables and overall health and well-being for their clients too. Mm-hmm. So they might be right in the same place in terms of this conversation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Considering medical needs doesn't mean, turning over the case to the other doctor or the other person necessarily. I mean, it certainly could. And in some of my cases, it's true that I do say, here's a referral. I think it's really important for you to follow up on this before it is safe for me to assess one more step of this case. And I do that sometimes. But almost always, it becomes a collaboration project now where I'm going to be sharing data on how it's going behaviorally and how the medical side effects are, bumping into the behaviors I was already tracking. And I want the medical providers to look at my cumulative records and make decisions about a medication adjustment based on what I'm seeing and vice versa.
Yeah.
So the rich collaboration has never, ever failed me, honestly. It has always been so rewarding.
I love that.
Well, I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I had a few more questions, or we had a few more questions, but I think they relate to things that will be best resolved in our dissemination station. You want to do it, Tom? I knew I should have made my Jackie soundboard for days like this, but you know what? You did a good job. Sorry, that came out all wrong.
Extremely authentic train sound.
It was a very good train sound.
Okay.
It was very good. I was thinking maybe I'd ask you if you wanted to make a fun train sound, but then it felt like that's a big ask of a guest to make goofy sounds to do a microphone. That will be saved forever in the internet.
Oh, that's okay. I can give you my son. He's 3, and he typically goes chugga 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 choo. I think that's a really good one.
I like that one.
Lot, yes.
That feels like it's a very
you.
purposeful train kind of heading into the station.
Yeah.
So I think when, we talked a lot about kind of big picture, big context, but in this section of the show, we like to share some kind of action steps. Certainly one of them would be for folks who still feel like, I don't know, I don't want to be outside my area of competence and I didn't do sleep studies or I haven't done, I'm not a nutritionist or I don't know a lot about trauma. I didn't have, the same undergrad in psychology as some of my peers. What would you say are some additional resources that would just be kind of like a good baseline of research? I know you mentioned Dr. Harris's book. It was the Deepest Well.
The Deepest Well. Mm-hmm.
So that I'm assuming would be one that you'd say everyone should probably throw on the book list.
Yeah, great reading. That's a great place to start if you like a book. Something else really, really helpful. So I'm going to say the article's got so many visual resources in it. And so, for example, if you want a table of all those medical studies that relate ACEs to medical problems, or if you want those visual aids, those job aids of here's a visual of the buffers, here's a visual of a flow chart to help you talk about buffers with somebody new, right? Here's a visual of the barriers that people might face.
Yeah.
But if you're not going to start with the article, I think another good place to start is just Cusp Emergence University. Mm-hmm. We have a training series right now, just started a few days ago. It's the buffers training series, but the first one is like 5 CEUs. And it's so many CEUs, not because the video is long, but because there's a lot of reflection exercises and action plans built in. It's like an on-demand workshop that companies can take. That's or
cool.
Individuals. But the thing is, we're trying to put the word out in terms of buffers. And so at the same time, if you don't need the CEUs, I'm doing this new thing where I make a version of my tools that is without jargon. And so that's there as well. It's like the buffer story for everyone. It's 15 minutes. You sign up for it. It's free. It's just a non-jargony 15-minute video of me talking about this. So that's a good place to start. But after that initial 5-hour thing, there's little special topics. So for example, we have one coming up on buffers and systems and how we integrate this from a company perspective. We have it for individuals. How do we do this with like self-care and our own active nurturance about ourselves? Yeah. So that's all available on Cusp Emergence University.
It's a very good. I've been there a number of times. Unfortunately, I don't know if you have this problem, but I love the papers because I can put them somewhere and I'll see them and they remind me, I want to reread that, or there's something in there. Yeah. Websites, I have such a hard time. I bookmark a lot of these sites. Like I think I have your site, it's bookmarked, but I don't see the bookmarks in front of me. And sometimes I'll hit a wall. I'll be like, what? how would I learn more about this? And it's in a file somewhere. So it's
Oh.
always good to come back. And
You have to do what I do,
What
which
can you
is
do?
leave every tab open on my
okay.
computer that I may ever want to revisit.
Okay, until Google
That's
is like,
key.
oh yeah, here's a Chrome update. But it's all closed now. I hope you remembered your 70 tabs. Your
Clearly,
life is over.
you should save it in a screenshot folder, Diana. That's
That
one
is
of my
smart.
hacks. Yeah, I have a
That's cool.
screenshot of all my tabs just for when my computer shuts down because it is tired of having 50 tabs open. But no, the other cool thing is we're trying to make this stuff barrier free, right? And I'm trying to center the ideas and not my words and face, right? I think the idea of the buffers has to get out there. It's good practice antecedent wise. It's important for you and me and our admins just as much as it is for our clients.
Yeah.
So whatever helps you with that, do it. And so part of what we're trying to do too is make the handouts as a download before you have to even get into the course. If you're not going to buy it, if you just take the preview and download a handout or two, save that in your folder, right? Trying to make sure people
That's
do
awesome.
not find barriers. Everything we have should be open access as much as possible. I'm not quite there yet, but we're working towards it.
Sure. Well, I guess that does lead into kind of our last question of sort of what's next for buffers. I mean, certainly in terms of getting the word out about buffers, we spoke a little bit about that, but kind of what are the big research questions that are still there? I know one you brought up in the paper was, are there ways that we can sort of combine treatment for one buffer and then see benefits in other areas? I think there was a study where they're working with families on sleep. And just by improving sleep, nutrition, and I can't remember if it was mental health or the relationships all improve, which makes sense because when we get enough sleep, we tend to make better choices. We tend to be more present. We tend to be able to interact more with our family members and our coworkers.
More
patient, right?
Yes.
So there's that. I mean, what are some other kind of questions that are still on your mind and you're hoping will get answered?
Oh, so many. But I love to start with the antecedent place. So what would happen if we all did this as an universal precaution-y implementable thing, right? Antecedent modification first. So before I even accept a new client, have I educated that family about where they can find these buffers in their community? Before I even accept a staff member on my team, have I told them about the buffers and how we value them at my company? And so that for me is huge. Now, what would happen in your company if you did that, right? That leads to the data development idea. You know, what are the key indicators? What would show you this is working? What does it mean that this is working, right? For some companies, it has looked at things like, am I going to have less recidivism? Are my clients going to show up to their sessions more? Are my staff going to feel more excited about working on goals that are related to this kind of stuff? And by the way, almost every single behavior need ties in some way to one of these buffers, by the way. And so when I do these preventively, am I going to see fewer challenging behaviors to deal with? Am I going to solve problems a little bit earlier? That kind of thing. The second piece for me, so there's the antecedent ideas. What would happen if we did this policy-wise? What would that mean for our data? Then there's this idea of what would happen if we scanned regularly for it? So when things change with our clients, what if we went back to this and taught caregivers to do it? Because often that's a big behavior cusp for a caregiver, is to learn to scan for these things before they make that call. Hey, I need more medication. Hey, judge, I might need a placement change. If we scan for these things, we sometimes do a lot of good without harming other pieces. Okay? And then I think another final one is addressing ethical issues. Like it's our ethical responsibility, I think, to be preventive as behavior analysts, to operationalize what that would really mean for our clients. But we're gatekeeping the buffers. We know about it, but are we actually doing it? Or are we I'm not doing if it's not fundable? And there's another ethical issue is as long as it sort of pays off to run the behavior reduction plans, if it's not paying off to run the preventive, to ask funding companies for this kind of support, we're probably not going to do it. And so resolving that issue is huge for me. And I'm working on that in other ways, policy-wise. Just getting the word out there, I think, is huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, Dr. Camille Kolu, thank you so much for coming on the show today, for sharing about this work, about your efforts to increase awareness, to improve the lives of clients. I think, again, I think we said at the top, we've enjoyed hearing about this from you before, and we were really excited to get a chance to grill you, about individually about articles today. It was a lot of fun, and we want to say thank you again. If folks are interested in reaching out because they also want to get an email from Camille answering their questions, is there a great place? I mean, there's behavioral cusp emergence or behavior.
No, Cusp Emergence University.
Yes, Cusp Emergence University.
You got it.
Sorry. Cusp Emergence University. That's why you make bookmarks, so you don't have to remember the URLs. But if they wanted to reach out to you directly, are you okay sharing like an email, or can they get to you through the site?
Yeah, well, I mean, both are fine. There's a blog, cuspemergence.com, but all the trainings and the resources are mostly on cuspemergenceuniversity.com. Mm-hmm. There's a little tab on the top up there that says something like get on the email list if you want to get the coupons and updates. But if they just want to email me directly, I would love that. Always open to that. It's just cuspemergenceu@gmail.com.
Excellent. Cool. One more time, we want to give a big thanks to Dr. Camille Kolu for coming on the show today to talk about buffers, talk about protective factors, what that means for trauma, being trauma-informed, trauma care. It was a great conversation. We've been a big fan of her work. So again, it was great having her on the show today. If you want to learn more about Dr. Kolu's work and get some more CEs, you can check out Cusp Emergence University. We'll have a link again in the show notes. It was very nice of Dr. Kolu to let us know about the site. I've been there a couple times myself, but if you want to learn more about buffers and barriers, this is a great place to learn in addition to the article and, of course, our episode we just had. But before we wrap up the show, let's move to our last segment, pairings.
All right, so it's time for pairings, which is the section of the show where I tell you about other episodes in our back catalog you might want to go back and check out if you enjoyed this one. We have several that I think you might be interested in referencing. They include episode 205, in which we had a conversation with Dr. Shala Alaei about joy in the Big Four. After we finished recording with Dr. Kolu, I said, this reminds me so much of this episode with Dr. Alaei, and it makes so much sense because Dr. Kolu was Dr. Alaei's student way back in the day. So I feel like there's a pretty clear through line there in terms of their way of thinking about these types of protective factors. You might want to check that out. Additionally, episode 121, where we discuss child welfare and the foster care system training for families with Dr. Jim Carr. Episode 204, trauma-informed applications in ABA with Dr. Ditu Rajaraman and Dr. Jen Austin. Episode 212, we talk about ABA and trauma-informed care with Sandra Bishop. Our very first book club, episode 1001, we talk about the Meaningful Differences book. I feel like that's relevant here. Episode 231, where we discuss emotional behavioral supports and the enhanced choice model with Dr. Joey Staubitz. Episode 32, where we talk about sleep with Dr. Sandy Jen. Episode 145, where we talk about self-care with Dr. Shane Spiker. Episode 187, where we talk about quality of life. And finally, episode 1008, where we're lucky to have Shala Alaei back on the show, as well as her co-author, Peggy Wolf, to talk about their Between Now and Dreams book in a book club episode. So feel free to go back and check out any or all of those. The other part of pairings is I like to recommend a snack that goes well with this episode. For this one, I was like, oh, what am I going to choose? And so I said, how about quote unquote buffer food? So meaning just like foods that are light and fluffy like a cloud that wrap around you. And so I have two different foods that maybe people have not had before. I don't really know. One of them is what I'm calling a pavlova, but that's because I've been watching a lot of Bluey, and I think it might also be called a meringue. But it's a delicious, again, egg white, mostly egg whites and sugar, and then it's baked together, right? You like those, Rob, actually. You like little meringues.
Oh, meringue.
But a pavlova is a big one. So you make it like a really big, then it has to like bake and basically dry in the oven for a long time. And then you put fruit and stuff on top.
Oh, cool.
So it's delicious and light and fluffy. And then also this thing that I know of from my childhood that we called green fluff. And
Sounds
it's
terrible.
basically,
No.
it's the way that my grandmother made it is pistachio pudding, marshmallows. I know Rob's already not a fan.
Yeah.
Possibly some Cool Whip and crushed pineapple. Oh, and she put pecans in there too. So you just basically stir all those things together and it makes a big, fluffy, green mess.
Oh, yuck. No.
Yum, yum, yum. So those are the buffers.
All right.
Please enjoy.
Thank you, Diana. Now that pairings is over and we're all running away from whatever that last concoction was.
It actually is really good.
Oh, okay. I'll take your word for it. That brings us to the end of the show. Thank you very much for listening. We appreciate all of our listeners here at ABA Inside Track. If you'd like to subscribe to the show, we'd really appreciate it. You can leave us reviews on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe on Spotify, all those places that you'll like to go. You can certainly go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to the articles that we discussed in this episode, as well as to purchase CEs. Speaking of CEs, do you want your second secret code word? Sure you do. It's grand piano. One word or two. We'll take either way. GRANDPIANO. It's like the really, really big piano with the top lifts up, and or if you have like a lounge singer, she could lie down or he could lie down on it. And you could do a whole number. It's great. Again, that's abainsidetrack.com. You can also email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content, you can subscribe on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can sign up as a free member, or you can subscribe at the $5, $10, or $20 levels. Each of those gets you more and more and more stuff. So everybody gets to vote on our seasonal book clubs and our seasonal listener choice episodes. We just had some polls go out for those. We just announced our book club list for the year. You can also get free CEs, discounts at the CE store, all sorts of fun goodies. We're doing Summer of Book Club right now. So if you have not been subscribed to the $10 and up level, you've been missing out on so many extra book clubs. You got to catch them all the book clubs, that is. That's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Some final thanks. Again, a big thanks to Dr. Camille Kolu for coming on the show, Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit, the podcast doctors, for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.